It began the moment Sophie opened her eyes. A strange, suffocating silence blanketed the house, even for Christmas morning. Snow piled against her bedroom window, its weight threatening to block out the faint light struggling to penetrate the glass. The heater groaned in protest against the cold. Sophie shivered as she glanced at her bedside clock. 7:12 a.m. Too early for the world outside to be this still. Her fingers brushed the icy doorknob as she opened the door. Stepping into the hallway, something felt wrong. The house should have smelled like cinnamon and coffee. It should have been warm, welcoming, but it wasn't. Instead, a faint draft carried the metallic tang of winter. Sophie followed it downstairs, her breath catching as she reached the front door. Snowy footprints trailed from outside, across the threshold, and into her living room. Her heart thudded painfully. She had locked the door last night, she was sure of it. "Sophie," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just snow. You must have forgotten to lock it, that's all." But her rationalization faltered when she followed the trail. The prints didn't belong to boots. They were bare, humanoid, but too long, with toes that seemed claw-like. She grabbed her phone from the counter and dialed the police, but the line crackled before going dead. Her stomach dropped. The snowstorm had come without warning, trapping Sophie in her late mother's home. She spent most of her first day nervously rechecking windows and doors, her imagination running wild with each creak of the old floorboards. The power flickered but didn't fail. By nightfall, she convinced herself the footprints were her own, distorted by the snow. Then, the music box started playing. Sophie froze in the middle of the kitchen. The haunting melody echoed from the living room, a familiar tinny sound. Her mother's old music box. She found it years ago at a flea market, its intricate carvings of snowflakes and angels, a thing of rare beauty. It hadn't worked in years. She peeked into the living room. The box sat on the mantelpiece, its lid half open, spinning its eerie tune. "Mom?" Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. The melody stopped abruptly. The next morning, Sophie woke to the sound of faint scratching. At first, she thought it was the storm, the wind howling against the old windows. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails scraping against wood. Her eyes darted to the... A snowman stared back at her. It wasn't there last. Sophie was sure of it. Yet now its hollow eyes seemed to bore into her. She stumbled out of bed, rushing downstairs to confirm her worst fear. The front door was locked, yet fresh footprints led from the snowman to her porch. Sophie tried to distract herself, but the unease only grew. The scratching persisted, growing louder, moving from one side of the house to the other. By afternoon, her reflection in the windows began to distort. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. When night fell, Sophie barricaded herself in the bedroom, determined to wait out the storm. That's when the whispers began. They called her name, soft and lilting. At first, Sophie thought it was the wind, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. She clamped her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth, tears streaming down her face. Then, the music box played again. Desperate for answers, Sophie searched the attic the next morning. Among her mother's belongings, she found a bundle of journals tied with faded red ribbon. Flipping through the pages, Sophie's breath hitched. Her mother wrote about him. The visitor in the snow, a figure that came every Christmas morning, leaving gifts in exchange for unspeakable sacrifices. She had made a deal years ago, saving Sophie from a fatal accident. The cost was her father, whose disappearance Sophie had always been told was a tragic accident. A shiver ran down Sophie's spine as she turned to the final entry. "The visitor will come again when the debt is due. I hope she forgives me." As night fell, Sophie felt the weight of eyes on her. She checked every lock, every window. The snowman in the yard seemed closer, its jagged smile stretching wider. The power flickered again. A loud bang came from the front door. Sophie screamed, backing into the kitchen. The pounding continued, slow and deliberate. Then, silent. She crept forward, heart hammering. The door was still locked. She turned to see him standing in the living room. The visitor was tall, his skeletal frame wrapped in a tattered coat. Snow clung to his hollowed cheeks, and his eyes were empty pits. His claw-like fingers extended toward her. "Your mother made a promise," he rasped. His voice sounded like the wind tearing through dead trees. "It's time to fulfill it." Sophie fled upstairs, locking herself in the bedroom. Her mind raced for solution. She grabbed the music box, hurling it against the wall, but its haunting melody continued. The visitor's voice echoed from every direction. "Come to me, Sophie." Desperate, she tore the journals apart, hoping for a way to end this nightmare. A single phrase stood out, circled in her mother's shaky handwriting: "The snow remembers everything." Sophie hesitated, a plan forming in her mind. She gathered every journal, every relic tied to the visitor, and carried them outside despite the biting cold. The snowstorm howled as she ignited the pile. Flames roared to life, and for a moment, she thought it was over. Then, she heard the whisper behind her. "Fire. cannot erase a promise. The storm consumed Sophie that night. Neighbors found her house empty the next morning, save for the charred remains of old journals in the snow. Dozens of snowmen stood vigil in the yard, each one a grotesque likeness of her, their faces frozen in silent screams. Sophie's name was never spoken again, but those who passed her house swore they could hear her voice on the wind, pleading for release, and every Christmas morning, a new snowman would appear. The snowstorm rolled into town, blanketing the streets in icy silence. Marcus wandered through the Christmas market, searching for the perfect gift for his 8-year-old daughter, Emily. Their first Christmas without her mother was approaching, and he was determined to make it special, despite the lingering grief that shadowed their lives. At the edge of the market, Marcus noticed a small, out-of-place stall. Its wooden shelves displayed an array of intricate toys, wooden soldiers, marionettes, and dolls with hauntingly lifelike expressions. At the center was an antique nutcracker, its painted grin oddly unsettling. "Handcrafted," a voice said. Marcus turned to see an elderly man, his hunched frame wrapped in a thick coat. His eyes glinted with an intensity that made Marcus uneasy. "How much?" Marcus asked. The old man smiled faintly. "For you? Consider it a gift." That night, Marcus gave the nutcracker to Emily, who was overjoyed. She played with it all evening, marching it across the living room floor. When it was time for bed, Marcus placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. The house felt quiet and warm again, as if, for a moment, the weight of loss had lifted. Marcus woke in the middle of the night to a faint scratching sound. Dismissing it as the wind, he went back to sleep. The next morning, the nutcracker was no longer on the mantel but on the floor, standing upright, its painted eyes staring at the Christmas tree. "Did you move it?" Marcus asked Emily over breakfast. She shook her head. "No, Dad, but he talks to me." Marcus felt a chill. "What did you say?" "He says he's protecting us," Emily whispered. Over the next few days, strange things happened. The nutcracker appeared in different places around the house, often in lifelike poses, its grin seeming sharper. At first, Marcus thought Emily was playing tricks, but the noises began. Soft clicks, like tiny wooden footsteps, echoing through the halls at night. One evening, Marcus found the nutcracker holding a lock of hair. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to his late wife. Shaken, he demanded to know where Emily had found it, but she insisted she hadn't touched the nutcracker. Determined to find answers, Marcus returned to the market, but the stall was gone, leaving no sign it had ever existed. His search for the toy maker led him to an old newspaper article about Elias Gruber, a craftsman from the 1800s. The article told of his descent into madness after the death of his son on Christmas morning. Gruber had created toys he claimed could house souls, and families who owned his creations were said to suffer unspeakable fates. Marcus's heart pounded as he read the warning. "Beware the nutcracker. It guards, but it also takes." That night, Marcus dreamed of his wife. She stood at the foot of his bed, her pale face etched with sorrow. "Get rid of it," she whispered, "before it's too late." He woke to find the nutcracker on his nightstand, its head turned toward him. His breath caught as its mouth opened slightly, and a faint, childlike whisper escaped. "You promised to protect her." On Christmas morning, Marcus discovered Emily's bed empty. Panicking, he searched the house, finally finding her in the basement. She stood motionless, surrounded by a circle of toys, dolls, puppets, and stuffed animals, all staring at Marcus with lifeless eyes. "They're here to play with me," Emily murmured, her voice distant. The nutcracker loomed in the shadows, its wooden frame grotesquely elongated. "You failed to keep her safe," it rasped. "Now she belongs to me." In a desperate frenzy, Marcus grabbed a crowbar and attacked the nutcracker. The toys came to life, clawing at him with cold, unyielding hands. He smashed them aside, finally striking the nutcracker's head. Its body collapsed, emitting an ear-piercing scream as Emily fell unconscious. Carrying her upstairs, Marcus vowed to leave the house forever. But as he packed, he heard the faint scrape of wood on the floor. He turned to see the nutcracker's severed head on the counter, its painted grin as wide as ever. The house was burned to the ground, yet Marcus knew the curse wasn't gone. In a distant town, an antique shop displayed a restored nutcracker on its shelf, its gleaming eyes waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. It was a bitterly cold Christmas morning when Rachel received the package. She wasn't expecting anything. Her family had stopped exchanging gifts years ago, and her social circle was too small for surprises. But there it was, sitting neatly on her doorstep, wrapped in faded green paper, with a red ribbon tied in a perfect bow. There was no return address, just her name scribbled in uneven handwriting on the tag. She hesitated, the icy wind biting at her fingers as she picked it up. The box felt heavier than it looked, and the faint scent of pine and something metallic lingered on the ribbon. Inside the house, Rachel sat at her kitchen table staring at the package. Something about it unsettled her. The paper was old, as though it had been reused for years, and the corners were worn and frayed. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She untied the bow and carefully peeled back the wrapping. Inside was a porcelain doll. It was dressed in a crimson velvet gown, with intricate lace details. Its glassy eyes were a piercing blue, and its painted lips curled in a faint, almost knowing smile. Rachel wasn't a fan of dolls. They reminded her too much of her late grandmother's cluttered house. But there was something about this, something uncomfortably lifelike. There was no note, no explanation. Rachel assumed it was a prank or a missed delivery. She set the doll on the mantel and tried to ignore it as she went about her day. That night, as Rachel prepared for bed, she thought she heard faint tapping sound. She paused at the base of the stairs, listening. The house was silent except for the groaning of the old radiator. Shaking her head, she dismissed the noise and climbed into bed. At 3:13 a.m., Rachel woke with a start. She wasn't sure what had roused her until she heard it again. Soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. She turned toward the window, but the curtains were drawn. Then the sound came again, louder this. It wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from downstairs. Her heart pounding, Rachel tiptoed down the stairs. The living room was bathed in the pale glow of the Christmas lights. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the doll. It had fallen off the mantel and was lying face down on the floor. With trembling hands, Rachel picked it up and placed it back on the mantel. The glass eyes stared back at her, unblinking. Just the wind, she whispered to herself, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The next morning, Rachel found the doll sitting at the kitchen table. Her breath caught in her throat. She was certain she had left it on the mantel the night before. Trying to steady her nerves, she chalked it up to sleepwalking, though she had never done so before. She carried the doll back to the living room and stuffed it into a box, shoving it deep into the hall closet. The day passed uneventfully, and Rachel began to feel silly for being so unnerved. But when she opened the closet later that evening, the box was empty. The doll was sitting on her bed. Rachel's hands trembled as she grabbed the doll and hurled it into the trash bin outside. She slammed the lid shut and rushed back inside, bolting the door behind her. She spent the rest of the evening trying to distract herself with holiday movies, but her mind kept drifting to the doll. At 2:47 a.m., she heard the tapping again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. She stayed in bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, her heart pounding. Then came the creak of a floorboard, followed by the soft sound of something dragging across the floor. Rachel's breath hitched as her bedroom door creaked open. The doll stood in the doorway. Its glassy eyes glinted in the dim light, and its painted lips seemed to curl into a wider smile. Rachel froze, unable to move as the doll's tiny porcelain hand reached up to push the door open further. She swore she could hear faint whispers, though she couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, the doll moved, its head jerking unnaturally to the side as it took a step forward. Rachel screamed, bolting from the bed and running out of the house without looking back. She spent the night in her car, parked in a well-lit lot, her eyes darting to every shadow. When dawn broke, she returned home, exhausted but determined to get rid of the doll for good. The trash bin was empty. Rachel searched every inch of the house, but the doll was nowhere to be found. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of relief. Perhaps it was over. That evening, as she sat on the couch trying to relax, her phone buzzed. It was a picture message from an unknown number. The photo was of her living room, taken from the corner of the ceiling. In the foreground was the doll, sitting on the mantel, its glassy eyes staring directly at the camera. Rachel's blood turned to ice. She bolted from the house and never returned. The house sat vacant for months before being sold to a new family. They found the doll in the attic, its crimson gown pristine, its painted smile as unsettling as ever. It became a decoration in their daughter's room, where it sits to this day. And every Christmas morning, faint tapping echoes through the house, growing louder each year.